I'm going to make a big assumption that you're probably not watching these videos until after Thanksgiving, so I pray that you had a wonderful Thanksgiving and that you're ready to come back to school and get this thing over with. Just a few weeks left, and then you'll be on to graduation. And isn't that exciting? So, exam, like the others, 40 multiple choice questions. I told you I was going to write 10 questions for this. I did. I also went in and modified some of the existing question stems. In other words, I used the test bank questions, but I changed them a little bit because I thought some of the answers were a little confusing, and I tried to make it so it would be a little bit clearer which is the right answer. So let's dive in. First up is the idea of corporate governance. If you remember, we talked about in small businesses, small to medium-sized business, a lot of times the owners and the managers are the same people, and therefore you don't have an agency problem. It's that as firms grow, that you start to have this separation between ownership and managerial control. It's important that you remember the basic concept of an agency relationship, which is when one party delegates decision-making responsibility to a second party for compensation. Again, in small to medium-sized businesses, a lot of times it's not an issue. Um, Sometimes later in life it does as the owner begins to become less involved or if they start other companies. But it's more prevalent in the big businesses. There's really no specific test questions off of this chart, but it's something you probably need to be familiar with to just help you navigate through the questions. Then we talk about the fact that monitoring and compensation are big parts of it, but you're going to see some more specific questions than that. In a publicly traded company, uh, or in a privately traded company for that matter, but one that have diffuse ownerships, there is typically a board of directors, and they're the people who have the primary responsibility for monitoring the managerial control. Um, in the board of directors, be familiar with the things they are supposed to do and be specifically familiar with what it means to be an inside, related outside versus outside director and the pros and cons of each. Also, this idea of CEO duality, which is when the CEO is the chairman of the board. I think I've got 3 or 4 questions where this idea of CEO duality is in the question. A lot of times those questions have more going on than just the duality, but something that you're going to for sure want to read the sections on that in the textbook carefully. Likewise, compensation. There's a couple of questions on compensation. So make sure that you read the sections about compensation and understand the difference between salary, bonuses, stock, and stock options. Stock options meaning that they have the right to buy the stock at a future price, not the guarantee, whereas stock grants, the stock is given to them. It's not something they have to buy. And I think the textbook does a further explanation of that, but be familiar with that. External control, this is when a company is typically underperforming. It could be involved by somebody coming in and buying them, thinking they can improve the performance, and sometimes these third parties. So again, there is a question on external control. Make sure you're familiar with that. Not sure that there's a question on any of these, but if you're familiar with them, it may help you answer the questions that are. Also, stewardship theory, take a look at that. Also, make sure you understand in the different countries which stakeholder is privileged. In other words, in the United States, which stakeholder is privileged, and in the other countries, which stakeholders are privileged. I think that will take care of Chapter 10. Back at you in a minute. Chapter 11 was about organizational structure. So I started off, this is not in the textbook, but I told you that usually when you're looking at the various types of organizations, uh, these are 3 key parameters that you want to evaluate, or factors: the communication, or how easy it is to share information throughout the organization, the cost inherent in these organization, and then the levels that have accountability. In other words, who can you hold accountable for what, and do they have the tools that they need to succeed? There's almost always trade-offs in these. There's no perfect solution. So no question on that. First one is the functional organization. Remember, functional organizations are great in that it allows deep functional expertise. It's often the least costly strategy to pursue in terms of it doesn't have a lot of duplication of efforts. But the weaknesses of the functional form is that it may hamper communication because these can create fairly deep silos. And then really there isn't anybody below um, the top dog that has profit and loss responsibility. So even though you could create sub goals for the various entities, those sub goals don't necessarily translate into overall P&L, and so that's a weakness. Because of that, we started to come up with a divisional form, though the I don't want to say the weakest, the most transitional is the cooperative form. And this is where you do create independent product divisions, which does put more accountability in, although typically not profit and loss accountability because they have a lot of things that they don't control. So you have a lot more up at the headquarters level. So you have some duplication of efforts in the divisions, not as much as other divisional forms. So this will be a less costly divisional form, but it doesn't have as much accountability built in, and it still should be pretty good at it's a significant step up in information sharing. In fact, this probably is the best one in terms of information sharing. The next type is called the SBU form, and this is where you have the separate business units. Uh, and this excels in the sense of giving profit and loss responsibility because this division has everything it needs. The corporate staff does still try to integrate information flow across them. This often has the highest cost structure because there's a lot of duplications within the divisions. It also has good communication flow, but not quite as good as the cooperative form. And then lastly, among the divisional structures, you have the competitive. This is usually pursued with unrelated diversification, and the divisions are very independent. They stand on their own. The strength of this is very clear profit and loss accountability and no real attempt to communicate across the divisions or share. So the idea of cost and sharing are somewhat reduced. But again, this is one where these division chiefs definitely know their job relies on the financial performance of their division. Because of the frustrations, the tension between the functional and the divisional, we have the matrix. Sometimes it's called the hybrid approach. I tend to call it the matrix. And this is where you're trying to have one form, but then have cross product teams that are, or cross projects that are along the other form. In this particular diagram, you've got the functional form on top. It could be the other way. It could be divisions where you'd have marketing function, manufacturing function. So it works either way. Um, the strength is you're trying to capitalize on the best of all worlds. The weakness is you have multiple bosses and it becomes very complex. And if you remember, that's where I showed you the video clip where Ann Mulcahy, the former CEO of Xerox, was talking about what she did. And specifically, you need to remember what she did because I thought it was a great summation of the matrix view and how she chose to build some additional accountability in the matrix. So if you don't remember that, if it's not in your notes, then click on the link and go back and watch her comments about what she did with the organizational form, and it's towards the end of the video. That's it for chapter 11. Next up, chapter 12 on strategic leadership. Interestingly enough, I'm not going to go back and change the exam now. I don't have this as a test question on the exam. I should have because that's one of the things I want you to walk away with. So pay attention, learn that, but it's not going to be on the exam, which also says that this is not really on the exam as well. Latitude is on the exam. Make sure you're familiar with the various factors and what goes where and be able to explain what's likely to increase or decrease a CEO's latitude. It's actually used about, understanding this chart will help you specifically in one question, and another two questions it will also help you get the right answer. Not anything on that question or on that chart. Make sure you definitely understand what social capital is and how it's developed and how it can be useful. Organizational culture, there's one or two questions on organizational culture. So be sure that you're aware of what it is and, very importantly, how it can be changed and what are the conditions under which it can be changed. So this chart as well will be important to you. Then there is at least one, maybe two questions. Well, yeah, there's actually two questions on ethics. So read the book. Um, This chart will be important. Also, remember that I told you the story of Michael Sears and Darlene Druyan, and we talked through that. And we talked about the fact that Boeing was fined $615 million, and that they had they figured out at the end of the day that it was tax deductible. Make sure you remember what Boeing did. I didn't actually talk about this in class because I ran out of time. But read the textbook section on the balanced scorecard. Understand why there is such a thing as the balanced scorecard, and what was new is companies had always looked at the financial numbers, and then they expanded. So this is where the balance comes into the scorecard. So make sure you understand why that was necessary and what are the strength of these strategic controls. Also, again, I ran out of time. Make sure you understand the textbook definition of heterogeneous versus homogeneous top management teams. And also, when you are turning a CEO over, when it tends to be better to hire an insider and when it tends to be better to hire an outsider. Okay, so much for strategic leadership. One more chapter to go. And lastly, on strategic entrepreneurship. These definitions, while interesting and important, are not on the exam. I think you all did a particularly good job in this exercise in class. No questions on it, but that understanding what we're talking about here is going to help you on the subsequent questions. Remember, we did talk about creative destruction, that almost always somebody else is doing something in the marketplace and you're simply displacing them. And I told you the story about my airplane, so make sure you understand creative destruction. This is why companies should be good at strategic entrepreneurship. You're going to want to know that. And this is why they typically aren't very good at strategic entrepreneurship. And you're going to want to know that as well. We talked about the different types of innovation, but they're all important. And specifically, I want you to know which of the above big companies tend to be good at, and then by reverse, which of these smaller startup companies or new companies tend to be good. Then we talked about what tends to make characteristics of innovative companies. Specifically, we talked about failure and how to handle that. And then a lot on the idea of autonomous behavior versus top-down, or what the textbook calls strategic induced behavior, I think is the name of it. So make sure you understand both types of basic approaches to internal innovation, and make sure you understand what makes each work, what are the evidences of each. So this is a very important part of the textbook to reread. There are several questions on that. Also, there is a question directly off of this slide, and I think understanding this slide will help you with one other question. So this is something we talked about in class. Hopefully you got good notes. There's an oblique question to this, so just understand the idea of external innovations. And that should have you in excellent stead for the exam. Again, 40 multiple choice, 50 minutes to complete it. If you have a burning question over the weekend, you can call or text me. I will be available all weekend. I look forward to seeing you on Monday afternoon.